Hello and welcome to this week's IG Live. Today we are going to be talking with Martha Seif Simpson, who has always been one of my favorite picture book authors. And some of you may know her from The Dreidel That Wouldn't Spin. There's also Esther's Gragger, What Not to Give Your Mother, her Mother's Day book. But we're also going to be talking about that, of course, this one because it's a lovely Hanukkah story and Hanukkah is coming up soon. And we're also going to be talking about another collaboration she has done with the same illustrator. Those of you who are familiar with this book or with Esther's Gragger will remember the lovely illustrations. So she has another collaboration coming up with the same author that we're going to get a little bit of a preview for, although we don't want to give too much away.
Hi.
Hi, good to see
Hi.
you again.
Good to see you too.
I was just talking about, I was excited to see that, you know, of course, a lot of people know you for these picture books. You have the Hanukkah book and one for Purim, and that you're going to be working with the same illustrator. And I got to see a preview of the new book, which has just the same kind of lovely illustrations in it, although very different setting.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I got to give a shout out to Yael. Durga Yael Bernhard has done all three books, as you said. And yeah, we have a great relationship, and we have the same editor for all three books too, Roger Catano. So I specifically wanted Yael for this book because I knew she'd be great at it. She did such a good job with the first two books.
Yeah, I mean, because the stories themselves are really wonderful, but the illustrations, I mean, they just go so well together. But
absolutely.
Go ahead. We're going to talk more about the new book, but I'm also interested in finding out, if we go back to the beginning, how you got started as an author. I mean, I know you were a librarian for a long time, but how did you get started writing children's books?
Yeah. Absolutely. So back in the 80s, we're talking in the dark ages now, I took a correspondence course on writing for children. Of course, they didn't have internet back then. So, you know, it was like writing letters back and forth. But I would, you know, write some short stories, get some feedback. And I did get a couple of short stories published in children's magazines after that. And when I decided to be serious about writing for kids, I joined the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, which is known as SCBWI. And I started going to critique groups and, you know, writing stories, getting feedback, giving feedback to other people's stories. I actually became a children's librarian. Well, I went to school to get my master's degree, Southern Connecticut State University in library science, and then I became a children's librarian. But actually, while I was in college, getting my master's degree, I did my thesis on summer reading programs. Oh. So my very first book was using that information, and I published a book called Summer Reading Clubs with McFarland and Company, and I actually wrote 5 books that were published by McFarland, all on library reference subjects. But then I decided, you know, by then it was like 1997, and I've had all these books out, and I figured, you know, I really want to be a children's writer, so I'm going to concentrate on writing children's books now. And yeah, during my career as a librarian, I went to lots of American Library Association conferences. I got friendly with Marjorie Kyler, who at the time was working at Marshall Cavendish, and I sent her a bunch of books back and forth. And she finally liked one of them, which became my first book, which is What Not to Give Your Mom on Mother's Day. So that was my first picture book published. And several years ago, I wrote a book called The Dreidel in the Window, and I entered it in the Tassie Walden New Voices in Children's Literature Award, which is in Connecticut, and it was a finalist in 2002. And that is the book that eventually became The Dreidel That Wouldn't Spit. So they changed the title, but that was that's how that book came in. And I found out about Wisdom Tales, the publisher, because of a SCBWI newsletter. So that is very helpful.
Oh, I love Wisdom Tales. They do a lot of great books. And
excellent.
One of the things that people may know about your first 2 books with Yael, The Dreidel That Wouldn't Spin and Esther's Gragger, is that they're set in Toyshop books, and which I know you said is inspired by your parents' toy shop. what was so special about that setting and kind of the sense of wonder that you did these toy shop books?
Well, my parents' store wasn't just a toy store. It was one of those little mom and pop variety stores, just one room in the front with a merchandise and another room in the back, to storage. And it wasn't just toys. We had groceries, bread and milk. They sold cigarettes, during the holidays, they sold flowers outside. But I think the main thing for me that was more wondrous, even more than the toys, was we had a penny candy counter, like a real counter where kids could go and look in the window and point to things and sold, you can get a whole bag of candy for just 10 cents because it was only a penny. And that for me was the real sense of wonder. The toys were cool too, though, because we had a small spot for them. And because the store was so tiny, my parents would string up a metal wire like near the ceiling and then clip all these blister packs of toys. So we'd walk in there and there's like toys hanging all over the place and there's a penny candy over there. So yeah, it was kind of cool to have the whole thing was like a sense of wonder. And I don't think kids are ever going to experience that again, the way it was in that little store.
Right. And I want to talk a little bit more about the dreidel, the wit and spin, because since we have Hanukkah coming up. And for those that have read it already know that it's about remembering the real spirit of the holiday. What do you hope that kids take away from this book? Or maybe you can tell us a little bit about it for those that don't know it. Showing some of it. Sure.
Well, some family background. I'm Jewish and my husband is Catholic. So when our 4 children were growing up, we celebrated everything. And when it came time to, Hanukkah and Christmas, Hanukkah is not really a major holiday for Jewish people, but because it's proximity in time for Christmas, it sort of got sucked into the whole commercialism of, having to buy presents. And, having to buy presents for 8 days plus Christmas for 4 kids got me a little frazzled. So, it just got to me that, it's too commercialized between both holidays. And I wanted to write a book about, it's not all about the toys. It's not about the commercialization. It's about really going back to remembering why we're celebrating this holiday and appreciating what you have, appreciating your family, and not just wanting to grab stuff. So for me, that was the main spirit of the book. And I hope that came across in the story.
It did. That's actually one of my favorite ones when we had with a local homeschool group. We would get together and have a holiday party. And I remember reading this, and the parents really liked it. The kids loved it. I think it was easy for them to get the point of the story. I think everybody like the message came across really clearly, and it's a fun book. And you also have.
I think it's unusual in that it has that kind of message, because a lot of books, even with Mother's Day, the whole point of most of the stories are what should I get for a present, and this way it's not getting, it's it's more spiritual. So that's what I like. Oh, and I want to do another shout out. This is for my daughter, who one year made me this dreidel that looks just like the one in the book. Yes. So I thought that's really cool. It looks exactly like the one in the book. So that's my daughter Jana, very creative.
Yes, and there's the one in the book people can see.
Right.
And you also have, of course, your beautiful book about Purim, Esther's Gragger. And so a lot of these, you're kind of reconnecting kids to traditions and stories. Why is that so important to kind of reconnect them, but also have them kind of look at it in a new way?
Yeah, for me, the biblical story of Esther has always been about a young woman facing a bully, and she had to save her people, and she had to stand up to him. And so I wanted to bring that theme back for children. And the people in the story, the biblical story, they're all adults, but I wanted to put some children in the story, and I thought the toy shop would be a perfect way to do that. So I set this book also in the same toy shop. And the plot is, Esther's brother wants to buy her a special dreidel, and then some other boy wants to come along and steal it. And Esther is the one that comes up with a way to standing up to the bully, and in a nonviolent way. And I think, bullying is a problem all the time. It's not just biblical times. It's always been a problem. And I think it's good for children to have a different kind of role model, maybe to get them some ideas about how to fight off a bully. But at the same time, it is a traditional story. But I think adding a child to it, making it, I mean, the story's not contemporary. It still takes place, maybe 100 years ago. But the idea of what the child does to stand up to the bully is, can be done anytime. And yeah, I do think it's important that kids look at stories, because they're universal themes.
Right.
And that's important, I think.
Yeah, which also relates to your new book, because I know we had kind of talked about that before this live, that again, you're taking a traditional story, but you're making it kind of at a child's level, because you're introducing a child character, you're making it more relatable. And then can you tell us about your new book, A Ring for a King, and which is coming out in the spring? I just made another.
Yeah. Ring for King in the spring. That's good. I like that. Maybe I'll use that sometime. The name of the story isn't the original story isn't A Ring for a King, but I can't tell you what the name of the story is because that's the punchline of the book. So you have to read the book to get, the traditional name of the story. But yeah, it was a story that I heard years ago, actually in a rabbi's sermon. It was part of the sermon, and that story always stayed in the back of my mind. But it was King Solomon. He's the king in the story. King Solomon with adults. It would be one of his sergeants in arms or one of his knights or something like that. It would be an adult, and it stayed in the back of my mind for a while. And then, a few years later, we had COVID, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, I want to write a story. And I was looking through some anthologies, and I came across the story again, and I thought, I did some research on it. And every story I found always had adults in it. So I said, let's do the same thing I did with the Esther story and put a child front and center in the story and make, him one of the protagonists or the main protagonist in the story. And so, that's what I did. Yes. And again, about writing it during COVID, COVID was a time that was all very difficult for everybody. And, we're wondering if we're ever going to get through this. And, how can people be inspired to have some hope? And in this story, the king wants to know how to give hope to people. And I think this story will kind of answer that, give some people hope for the future that things are going to get better at some point.
Right. And I think it's also a story about the power of words and what we say.
Right.
Like you said, how words can bring comfort and can inspire. So talking more generally, for you, especially, being a children's librarian for so long and now an author, why are reading and storytelling so important, especially for children?
Yeah. Well, of course, you read to learn things, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. You're always learning things when you read. And the same thing, when you're listening. And storytelling, it's been going on for years, since the beginning of time. People tell stories before they could even write. They remembered things, they learned things by telling stories. It was the oral tradition. And it's still important to children and even adults to listen to stories because, you're learning different things. You learn about different cultures, other people's traditions, other lands. You learn new words. You learn about people. I think storytelling gives us humanity. It shows people in all kinds of lights. It shows people who can get along with each other. And people who listen to stories can develop empathy for the characters. And also, people learn that they're not alone. Other people have had the same kinds of problems, different, same situations, these same universal themes that happen over and over again happen in stories. And, people in the stories have problems. They learn how to solve them and learn resilience. And in the same thing, like we said, words have the power to heal. And the stories have the power to do that as well. So I think that's especially important for children and adults as well.
Right.
Stories are
fun. And I find, as a parent myself now, I find that it feels like it's harder and harder to get kids interested in reading because there's so much competition, when you're talking about a tablet and or video games. Do you have any tips for how to keep kids excited about reading, and especially kind of in the very noisy world that we live in today?
Yeah, well, I mean, as a librarian, we have kids coming in all the time. And when kids are looking for books, the things I would do is I go up to a child and say, well, what are you interested in? Do you like sports? Do you like unicorns? Do you like to read about trucks? Do you like to read about people? Depending on how old they are, I bring them to the correct section in the library where books for their age would be. And, if they can tell me what they're interested in, then I can find something that would match that interest. Or I could tell them ask them what was the last book that you read, and that you liked, and I'll find something again in the same vein. And nowadays, like you said, kids are distracted with the video games and TV and movies and all that stuff. But in a way, that's an opportunity because you have kids asking for books with TV characters, Peppa the Pig or that kind of thing. So you can read those books. You have to have those books in the library because they're popular. There are books that their friends read, so you want to find books like that for kids. So during story times with the younger kids, we'd read them stories and then say, here are some other books like that on the same theme. Check these out. When we'd have people coming in for class visits, we'd book talk a whole pile of books and say, here are some books that you might like to read. We would do that, to kick off the summer reading program. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can get kids to read. You just have to be willing to interact with them and find out what they're interested in.
And I love how you say that to see it as an opportunity as opposed to just, because sometimes it just feels like this big challenge. But if you see it, like you said, as an opportunity, then that kind of opens up the door to a lot more kinds of books you might like.
Yeah, I mean, there are some people, some librarians that think that, oh, well, we want to give kids literature, we want to give them good stuff to read. We're not going to, take this mass markety stuff. But really, if the kids want to read mass market stuff, fine. If they want to read Dogman, fine. It gets, comic books, it gets them reading. I mean, I learned how to read one comic book. So, back in the day. So I think anything that gets kids reading is fine. And then later on, when they outgrow that, you can introduce them to something else.
And that also kind of speaks to the idea of why we need diverse books, because of course you need books that kids can relate to, or like you were talking about before, about being able to learn about other cultures and ways of life. And I know you've done a lot to support the Jewish children's literature. I don't know if you want to maybe mention a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I mean, Read Your World is doing great work as well. I want to give pat on the back to you and the people that are involved in that, because your whole mission is to amplify diverse books, different cultures, different people all over the world. And I think kids really have to learn that, and again, it's learning about universal themes, humanity, empathy for people. It's not, we have a global society, we're not just all living, in our little state or our little town or whatever. We have to learn how to get along with everybody. So I think, multicultural books, that's the thing. You really should amplify those books. I'm glad to do that.
Yes, well, thank you for all the work that you're doing and for giving us such great books to amplify. Do you have any
Thank
other?
you.
I mean, we've mentioned that A Ring for a King is coming out, I think in April. Do you have other projects you're working on or that you're looking towards?
Well, it's always funny when people say, what is your next book? Because for me, I don't have any one book. I'm working on a whole bunch of things at the same time. I have like a file drawer full of ideas of partly written manuscripts or books that I've written that I put aside and then go back to every once in a while to get them critiqued and rewrite them and whatever. So it's not just one book, but I do have a particular book that, cross my fingers, hopefully will be getting the attention from a publisher. That happens to be an easy reader, but I can't say anything yet. But hopefully that will be my next book. But again, I'm always writing different things. So
what was the experience like for you writing an easy reader after writing so many picture books?
Yeah, it is different because you have to have a more controlled vocabulary. And, sometimes when I've read that book to people in critique groups, they don't really understand I'm not using contractions. You know, you can't say, I don't want to do that. You have to say, I do not want to do that. Because, you know, for children in first, second grade, even kindergarten, you know, 5 to 7-year-olds, if they're just learning how to read, you have to make it easy for them. You have to use simpler sentence structure, you know, words with just 1 or 2 syllables. So it is different. And that's the first one I think I've successfully written. I've tried before, and it is hard to write them. But, you know, I've been wanting to, you know, I've seen, we have a big, we're in the library that I worked at, we specifically pulled out the easy reader books, fiction and nonfiction, because there are so many kids that, you know, they want those books and the parents want those books because they're learning.
Right.
So it is a different genre, but important.
Yeah, I always thought that was that's funny because it's sometimes for older kids than are necessarily reading picture books. I mean, of course, picture books are for any age, but you know, they kind of, a lot of kids graduate from picture books to easy readers, and actually the vocabulary and the sentence structure, like you said, becomes simpler because they're reading it on their own, learning to read on their own.
Right, and there's actually different levels of easy readers too. You've got the books with, you know, 1 word a page, and then the books with maybe 3 or 4 words a page, and then you've got short chapter books too. So there is a range in that, but you know, it's very necessary because kids want to read books on their own, and you don't want to give them something that's, you know, above their heads too much. Although it's you want to give them something they can sound out the words and ask for parents or, you know, someone else's help to do that.
So. Must be a real art making it something easy, but also still interesting for them.
Yeah, I find easy readers harder than picture books, actually.
Sounds like it. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And when that comes out, we'll be sure to share about it in our stories. And
I hope. It's like we're still in the process of negotiating. But hopefully we'll have something to talk about in another couple of years.
Yes, and in the meantime, of course, we also only have a few more months before Ring for a King comes out, so we look forward to that. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to this one. So.
Well, thank you for joining me today. For everybody watching, thank you for coming on here. If you joined us late, this will be up in a few minutes on Instagram and later on our YouTube channel. So thank you for watching today, and thank you. It was such a pleasure to talk with you.
It was a great pleasure talking to you as well. And again, I'm very proud to support Read Your World and Multicultural Children's Book Day because it's so important. So thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. We appreciate your support. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.